No.
There it goes.
Do I need to? That works? Okay, that sounds better. Anyway, I'm Seth Cropsey, a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute and director of Hudson Center for American Seapower. It's a pleasure to see such a good turnout on this somewhat gray Friday. Welcome to this conference on the People's Republic of China's increasing pressure on Taiwan. Like official China's virulent reaction to the tweet of the Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey, China's efforts to isolate Taiwan, prevent Chinese citizens prevent Chinese citizens from visiting Taiwan, and military provocations, as well as scores of other similar actions, are proof of the PRC's deep and abiding insecurity. With basketball, the insecurity displayed itself over Hong Kong. Taiwan's existence as a prosperous, self-governing, and Chinese-speaking state generates at least as much insecurity, I would say more. Taiwan is unique. China can pay other states to impose its will, as, for example, is shown by local authorities' detainment of Falun Gong practitioners who were performing their weekly exercises in the Freedom Park in Athens on November 10th. When Xi Jinping arrived for a state visit on the same day, the ancient Greek city's fathers are more interested in pleasing a foreign autocrat than honoring its history as the cradle of democracy. But Taiwan has proved resistant to this kind of intimidation. American leaders should consider the possibility that China's purchase of port facilities in strategic areas around the world may someday result in pressure applied to governments to close their ports to U.S. Navy ships. The PRC's intimidation of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and the Uyghurs should not be dismissed as merely a continuance of Beijing's age-old effort to prevent centripetal forces from shattering their imperial dreams. It is a threat to the U.S.'s global naval dominance, and thus an instructive lesson for Americans who hope that trade relations between the U.S. and China are so big that profound differences, all of them, can be resolved. For all intents and purposes, Twitter is banned in China. So the basketball manager's comment I mentioned a moment ago was invisible. This is important. Alongside insecurity, Beijing's attempt to have the basketball official fired shows its ruler's overarching goal of global domination. Basketball is small potatoes compared to the ability to prevent Americans or anyone else who lives in a free society from exercising their right to free speech within their own country. There are plenty of other examples. I won't mention them, but I cannot resist Paramount Pictures' pathetic removal of Taiwan and Japan's flag from the jacket that Tom Cruise wears in the remake of Top Gun, a concession to Tencent, the Chinese company that has partnered with Paramount Pictures. I'm afraid this is one movie that I will miss. The intimidation that Taiwan faces today is like the bell that the English poet John Donne described in his early 17th century poem, which is overquoted, but for a good reason, for whom the bell tolls. Donne cautioned never to send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. China's attempt to intimidate Taiwan is an attempt to intimidate all free societies. We have the pleasure of hearing from 4 experts today who will address in detail the particular areas of the PRC's growing aggressiveness toward Taiwan. Christian Whiton, who has held senior positions in corporate finance and communications in the private sector and in government as a senior advisor to the Bush and Trump administrations, especially on Asia, will discuss what China has been doing to apply diplomatic pressure to Taiwan and how Taiwan is responding. Christian will also look at Chinese pressure in the form of preventing its citizens from traveling to Taiwan, a policy that may have eased up the crowding at Taiwan's National Palace Museum, but also restricts the ability of mainland citizens to experience a successful Chinese-speaking democratic society. Rick Fisher, formerly of the Heritage Foundation's Asia Studies Center and currently a senior fellow on Asian military affairs at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, and a prolific author on U.S. security, diplomatic, and economic interests in Asia, who has appeared often to testify before congressional committees of the Senate and House, will speak next. Rick will examine the current state of the PRC's military preparations that are aimed specifically at attacking and conquering Taiwan. This covers the spectrum from amphibious to naval forces, as well as missiles and the ground forces that would be used were an amphibious attack to succeed. Ian Easton is Senior Director at Project 2049 Institute in Arlington, where he studies and publishes widely on military and foreign policy in and toward Asia. Formerly an analyst for the Center for Naval Analysis, he lived for 5 years in Taiwan and has studied advanced Mandarin in both Taiwan and the PRC. He has lectured at the U.S. Naval War College, Taiwan's National Defense University, and Japan's National Defense Academy. Ian will discuss the military provocations that the PRC has conducted by sea and air against Taiwan over the past year, and, time permitting, going back a little further. Riley Walters analyzes Asia's economy and technology for the Asia Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree in economics at George Mason University and worked at the Competitive Enterprise Institute prior to his current position. He has lived in Asia for 2 years and was a Penn Kemble Fellow with the National Endowment for Democracy. Riley's subject today is the indirect pressure that the PRC is exerting on Taiwan through its handling of the Hong Kong protests, its effect on Taiwan, and the direct consequences that the PRC is seeking to achieve by interfering with Taiwan's upcoming national elections. One final note. During the question period that follows our speakers' presentations, would you please remember to, when recognized, identify yourself by name, along with the organization you represent, and also if you would say to whom your question is addressed. And finally, would you please do everything possible to ask your question in the form of a question? I have some experience with the other form. Thank you very much. Christian, it's all yours.
Thank you, Seth. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Seth, for inviting me to be on the panel. It's great to see a lot of friendly faces, familiar faces at Hudson, a place I've looked up to for a long time. There's one face I'm not happy to see, which is Steve Yates back there, who covered Asia for Vice President Cheney and was a spy, a missionary, a businessman, a policy analyst, a politician relating to Taiwan, because almost all of my ideas are stolen from him, expropriated in typical CCP fashion. It's really an extraordinary time when probably this is not news to any of you regarding China, both over there and over here. When I was in the Bush administration, junior political appointee, first a speechwriter, and then I was working on North Korean human rights. Those of us who were working sort of broadly defined against the CCP, so the Democracy Bureau, the Tibet Office, the North Korea Human Rights Office, et cetera, we actually had a gathering called Panda Spankers. to understand panda spankers, you have to know the opposite of a panda spanker is a panda hugger, which is, many of you probably know, is what you call someone who's too soft on China. And this was at a point where the Deputy Secretary of State, in an administration that said it cared about human rights and had that as sort of an animating central tenet of its foreign policy, literally went to China and hugged. Huawei. There we go. So if you can contrast that, just the idea when a tariff for a national security reason placed on China would have seemed ludicrous, would have gotten you certainly thrown out of the Treasury Department, thrown off the 7th floor of the State Department. A time where President Bush went to Beijing for the Olympics, said it was just as a sports fan, didn't even raise human rights. Contrast that to, was it just yesterday, the day before, where the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act passed the Congress. It passed with unanimous consent in the Senate, and only one person dissented in the House, and incidentally is the same vote margin that World War II passed with. Hopefully the resemblance ends there. But China hasn't changed. It really has been doing what it's doing presently for quite a while. The idea that economic liberty would lead to political liberty, and frankly, they don't even have that much economic liberty, that's been thoroughly disproven to the extent that it's accepted really by both political parties in Washington. I mean, the bill that passed was one of the few pieces of bipartisan legislation co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, I think Cardin. It really is an amazing turnabout. China is belligerent. A number of our colleagues will go into that a little bit more. China engages in cyber warfare. China engages in political warfare. I will talk about that one. China has disputes with not just some of its maritime neighbors, but in fact all of its maritime neighbors, and frankly, it's many of its land neighbors too. This has finally had a significant effect on Washington. A little more on the Chinese political warfare against Taiwan, which frankly impacts us too. There's the obvious stuff. There's the hissy fit that China will demonstrate whenever we talk about selling arms to Taiwan. There's the hissy fit that they have whenever we permit a transit stop for one of the senior officials of Taiwan, which is the artifice that we have to use to let them come. Leaders from a fellow democracy can't just come here ordinarily. They need that. China always gets upset about that. And then there's sort of the overt political warfare of China taking away Taiwan's dwindling numbers of diplomatic allies. These are countries that recognize Taiwan instead of China. You just had 2 more fall in September. Small places, Kiribati, the Solomon Islands. That leaves a handful of others, especially in Central America, that have formal relations with Taiwan. And then, of course, here in the United States, we have the TECRO, which is really not the same as an embassy and is constrained in a number of ways. So that's sort of the situation, or at least part of it, with China's political warfare against Taiwan. There's economic warfare, too. I'll get to that. I would argue, and as I've said, there's been this 180 in China policy, but that President Trump is actually pretty good on Taiwan, especially if you compare him to his predecessors. He took a congratulatory phone call from President Tsai Ing-wen. And even though there's sort of a rumor in this town that he regrets that it was stupid, that it violated protocol, he has never recanted, he's never rebutted it, he's never said he was wrong. And in fact, again, I stole this information directly from Steve, right after that call, this is very interesting because it sort of shows how Trump thinks about Taiwan. He said, quote, "The president of Taiwan called me," all caps, "today to wish congratulations on winning the presidency. Thank you." Then later he tweeted, "Interesting how the U.S. sells Taiwan billions of dollars of military equipment, but I should not accept a congratulatory call." And, so what we see here is not the freedom agenda, not sort of free world versus communist world, but still, something that's transactional. But nonetheless, if you stand back and look at the overall policy, toward China. It's considerably more hawkish than it was before. And that transactional relationship, at least at the presidential level, has led to the sale of advanced F-16s, tanks, missiles, and other materiel that was really hard to move in previous administrations. And also, even if Trump isn't jumping up and down and saying, democracies band together against China, if you look at speeches from Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, plus the trade war, of course, I mean, these are really different approaches to dealing with China than previous administrations. Nonetheless, I do think the administration can do better. If not now, when? It's never going to be a good time to be tougher on China. There's always an excuse. Right now, it's this phase 1 trade agreement. It's always going to be a sensitive time. But one thing I think the administration could do, especially in regard to the political warfare I discussed, it's twofold. One that's direct, one that's indirect. The direct way is that every time that Beijing succeeds in flipping a country from Taiwan to China, that we send a cabinet secretary to Taiwan. If they're going to reduce Taiwan's ability to conduct diplomacy, then we are going to do what we can to make them whole again, or at least bring them back to even. In reprise, I believe the Clinton administration actually did send a cabinet secretary. We should do that every time they flip it, and incidentally, we owe them about 3 visits for countries they've flipped to. Similarly, when China prevents Taiwan from joining the World Health Organization, which isn't just politically venal and vindictive, but genuinely stupid and reckless, we should send the HHS secretary or the 4-star admiral who runs the U.S. Public Health Service to Taiwan again to make up for the diplomacy that Beijing has undermined. And we're not doing this, we wouldn't do this, I would say, just to enrage China, even though clearly Beijing would be enraged, but to create obvious consequences so that there is a predictable outcome to Beijing's political warfare, something that we can all understand. Then I'd say, if that's direct, then there's also, an indirect way to counter China's political warfare, and that is to allow senior officials from Taiwan, a fellow democracy, and a key partner in the Pacific to visit. I mean, crazy. We've sat down and hashed out deals with Iran. That is a country we don't have diplomatic relations with, technically. North Korea, our president has met with their leader 3 times. And every previous administration has had prolonged diplomatic discussions over nuclear weapons and other issues. So even if we don't have diplomatic relations with them, but we meet pervasively. And then with Taiwan, where we have this artifice from the one China policy, it would not be the end of the world, and I think it would certainly be appropriate if their president wants to come and have meetings in Washington, D.C., if their foreign minister and others, they should be able to come here and not under the artifice of a transit stop on their way to Haiti or one of the dwindling numbers of countries that they have relations with. There's a little bit of a start on this. In the Senate, I was just up on the Hill yesterday, and Senator Cruz is introducing something called the Taiwan SOS bill. That stands for Symbols of Sovereignty. It's kind of a mouthful. And what this will do, it won't do everything that I just advocated, but it would peel back some of the extreme insults of Taiwanese that are inflicted by this one China policy protocol, such as when Taiwanese students are at West Point, it's really easy to figure out who they are because they're the only ones there who are not allowed to wear the uniform of their country as exchange students. Similarly, if you want to have a sensitive discussion with a Taiwanese diplomat, good luck, because you have to meet them in a coffee shop or a restaurant. Never did we ever agree with Beijing that Taiwanese diplomats would not be allowed in our State Department, in the White House, in the Pentagon. These are things we have inflicted on ourselves for reasons that are known only to the authors and, I guess, to the Chinese. That can be done away with. So I hope that bill is a good start, but I hope they build on that. And then just finally touching on Chinese economic warfare, having covered the political warfare part. You do have a reduction in visitors, as Seth alluded to. There is the upside that you don't get pushed and shoved as much at the National Museum anymore when you're going to look at the jadeite cabbage. But it has had a limited economic impact. Just Chinese individual visitors can no longer come to Taiwan unless they're part of something more organized. But that impact is fairly limited. It's been made up for somewhat because of the diplomatic tiff between Japan and South Korea, which is also sort of fan the flames of the cultural animosity between those two peoples. And instead of Japanese going to Korea or Koreans going to Japan, a number of tourists have been going to Taiwan as an alternative. I think the real solution to Chinese economic warfare, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg, but it's the more extant symptom, would be a free trade agreement with Taiwan. We are both economies that are at the same speed financially, legally. They have the rule of law, we have the rule of law. They have enforceable contracts, we have enforceable contracts. Things that you don't have on the mainland, you do have in Taiwan. And building on that, I think, would be important symbolically, but also benefit us economically and have a security benefit as well. So, one last thing I don't want to steal Riley's thunder, who will talk about Hong Kong, but the topic today is the Chinese threat to Taiwanese sovereignty. For the longest time, there was a question of whether the Taiwanese would fight. If they were attacked militarily, if Beijing doused the country in hundreds of missiles, thousands of missiles. I mean, if you talk about the time it would take to get a carrier group, for example, out to the South China Sea, it's variable. Would the Taiwanese last even that long? And then set aside the military question. What about the political one? Are they eventually going to give in to Beijing's bullying and accept some sort of political union with China? One country, two systems, maybe? What we've seen in Hong Kong, I think, disproves those concerns, or certainly undermines them. Hong Kong, even more than Taiwan, was supposedly the place that just cared about money. And as long as they had some veneer of one country, two systems, not being completely subsumed by the mainland, they would be fine. We've seen that's not true. We've seen that Hong Kong, money-obsessed, capitalist, cares a lot about the political freedoms they have, and they're not willing to give them up willy-nilly, and they're willing to accept economic pain, and they're going to have a lot of it. First big recession, the biggest economic decline since the 1997 financial crisis. And Taiwan is different a little bit than Hong Kong, but nonetheless, frankly, I think the spirit you see in Hong Kong applies to Taiwan. It's already vastly improved the political fortunes of Tsai Ing-wen, the president, so that she's highly favored, I would argue, for re-election, whereas before it looked pretty iffy. So a lot of very interesting things going on over there. And thank you. Rick. Yep.
Well done.
Okay. Mic on? Mic's on. It is always a pleasure to join my former boss, Seth Cropsey, here at the Hudson Institute. As he did at Heritage years ago, Seth has provided leadership and energy for the policy community in Washington, as well as for all of the fans of Hudson, not only sitting here today, but joining us online. Hudson's program goes from strength to strength, and again, it's a pleasure to join Seth in this program today with some very notable experts. All right. Maybe we have to advance these. There we go. Okay, I'll just call it out if it doesn't work. All right, thanks. Tired of impeachment yet? I suggest you tune in to East Asia. Just in the last 24 hours, we've witnessed the House passing a landmark bill on Hong Kong. Less reported has been the first visit, probably since before 1979, of a Department of Defense Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense to Taipei. A very significant elevation in our diplomatic military relationship with Taiwan. And then this morning, we're greeted by a report that China may have tested a 10 to 20 kiloton nuclear device in the South China Sea. that report has turned out to be false. There's no corroborating evidence. And I say again, there was no nuclear test in the South China Sea. But reports like that remind us of the force and fury that is gathering on the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere in Asia. The danger of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is real, and it's growing. The internal political dynamics, I hope, will be addressed by our good friend Ian Easton, who has written probably the best book examining the politics and realities of an invasion of Taiwan. China has been building its forces for invasion. It has mechanized its marine, ground force, and airborne forces to be able not just to get to Taiwan, but to exploit any beachhead or landing zone to capture distant objectives. And these ground forces, generally, are going to be supported by potentially thousands of new short-range ballistic missiles, medium-range hypersonic, new hypersonic missiles, 5 families of precision-guided munitions, and in a vast growth in the Army's aviation corps. Next slide. However, there are 2 caveats. As Ian makes clear in his book, an invasion of Taiwan would be like D-Day, potentially times 5, times 10, because of the need for China to send not just invasion forces, but a far greater occupation contingent. Millions of police, officials. Think of Xinjiang, which is becoming occupied for the purpose of dismantling a local culture. An occupation of Taiwan would be disastrous, not just, especially for the people of Taiwan. Forced mass migrations, rounding up of political activists, probably in the hundreds of thousands. Refugee flows to the Philippines. We could go on. An invasion would be very difficult. Because of the weather on the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese would have to have 2 or 3 times the luck that the Allies had on D-Day. However, they can make their luck, and I contend they're investing in luck when they create nuclear missile-armed states in North Korea, Pakistan, and Iran. They are investing in the creation of potential mass diversions for the United States that would very much increase the chances of success of an invasion on the Taiwan Strait. Next slide. In terms of getting to Taiwan, formal airborne lift is small. But we know that the People's Liberation Army has high ambitions. There are indications that they may want up to 400 of their C-17 size Y-20 transport. Helicopters, they may want 3,000 of those, about as many as the American military has today. They're not there yet, but they're building them, believe me. Next slide, please. But in terms of informal airlift, today they already have more than 4 times the airlift capacity in the civilian airliner companies than they have today in the formal Air Force. And Boeing and Airbus have sold China about 3,000 airliners. Chinese fly about 1.6 million passengers a day. Taiwan's 6 largest airports could take in 175,000 passengers a day if they were captured and secured, over 5 million in a month. If you look at an initial occupation force of, based on the Xinjiang standards of putting a Communist Party representative in each family, there are about 8.5 million family households in Taiwan. They could possibly reach that level of occupation within 1 to 2 months. Next slide, please. Just an airlift alone. And then there's sea lift. Formal sea lift in the PLA Navy is approaching a level of about possibly being able to take 50,000 troops plus about 1,000 tanks in formal hit the beach, D-Day type operations. Next slide, please. But informal sea lift, the potentially coming from over 100,000 riverbound roll-on, roll-off barges, plus scores of large ferries. About 5 years ago, one Taiwanese estimate held that informal sea lift could move about 8 to 12 divisions, or up to about 120,000 troops. This is a very significant threat that is really underreported. Next slide, please. And they're investing in taking the beach. When we landed in Normandy on D-Day, we did so with the benefit of having invested in families of vehicles that allowed our troops to secure the beach, that addressed specific threats on that beach. The Chinese have made similar investments. Very few places that you can land on Taiwan like on D-Day. Much of the seashore consists of mudflats, and they have invested in platforms that they will lay on the mudflat in order to allow the vehicles to enter. Next slide, please. And these forces, as I mentioned, are increasingly mechanized. PLA Marines is on course to building up 6 brigades, 2 for each of 3 PLA Navy fleets. These brigades are re-equipping with new wheeled medium-weight combat vehicles and the new ZTQ-15 light tank. These vehicles are much easier to transport and especially to transport from ship to shore. Next slide. The PLA ground forces will be contributing heavily to the invasion contingent. And they too are deep into a transition to medium weight units. The ground forces may have as many new medium weight brigades as the United States Army has medium weight striker brigades. Next slide, please. The Airborne Corps is also the path to mechanization. A year ago at the Zhuhai Air Show, new vehicles, airborne, air-droppable vehicles were revealed. The Airborne Corps' first airborne tank with a 100 millimeter gun, developed by the Russians for launching laser-guided anti-tank missiles, new air-droppable rocket artillery, and we've also seen new air-droppable 122 millimeter artillery. Next slide, please. We're also beginning to see the possible beginning of the deployment of second-generation short-range ballistic missiles. Right now, our Department of Defense credits the PLA rocket force with about 1,500 short-range ballistic missiles. With second-generation systems, you can go from one transporter carrying one missile to one transporter carrying up to 8 short-range ballistic missiles. Based on current numbers of launchers, if they all transitioned to second-generation SRBMs, you're looking at total missile numbers that would exceed 10,000. At the last October 1 military parade, we saw for the first time a new Army multiple rocket launcher that basically launches a rocket with the range of a short-range ballistic missile. This may be the first of the second-generation SRBMs. Next slide. And as I mentioned, China has invested heavily in precision-guided munitions. The H-6 bomber can carry up to 36 precision-guided, satellite-guided, 1,000-kilogram smart bombs. Investments in unmanned combat aerial vehicles, unmanned combat ships, surface ships, and soon in the future, submarines, all complement aerial precision strikes by new classes of attack helicopters. Next slide. Several years ago, there was an estimate that by next year, the PLA Air Force may have over 1,500 fourth-generation combat aircraft. Taiwan is lucky if it can maintain over 300 fourth-generation combat aircraft. Those are getting better, and they have to quickly. Next slide, please. So what do we do to sustain deterrence? Well, probably the most important single program underway in Washington today is the Trump administration's effort to get out of the constrictions of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and to rebuild American theater missile forces. This must succeed if we are to hold the balance of deterrence on the Taiwan Strait. And we must also share these new missiles with our allies and partners, including Taiwan. Last slide. When the PLA invades, there are going to be thousands of platforms, thousands of barges, ferries, possibly 1,000 or more airliners. Taiwan dearly requires 10,000 of something, be it long-range, 70, 150-kilometer range artillery shells that are under development here, laser systems with magazines only limited by their batteries, or very cheap cruise missiles that can be built affordably by the thousands. This can be done. It need not break the bank. We can continue to deter the People's Liberation Army on the Taiwan Strait into the 2020s and indeed into the 2030s. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Miss, could you go back to the picture of the bomber? Good afternoon. In February of 2015, at a time when U.S.-China relations were at a height of warmth and friendliness, and China-Taiwan relations were also very, very warm, Xi Jinping visited a strategic bomber base in central China. And soon thereafter, photographs emerged on Chinese state media of him sitting in the cockpit of that nuclear-capable long-range bomber. A month later, China began conducting regular long-range patrols out north of Taiwan, flying between Taiwan and Okinawa, down towards Guam, U.S. territory, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and then south of Taiwan, between Taiwan and the Philippines, going in the same direction, towards U.S. territory, simulating attacks on our critical military bases in the Western Pacific. And this went on for about 18 months. And then in November of 2016, PLA bombers, People's Liberation Army bombers, started to circle all the way around Taiwan. So they would take off in the north, they would circle around the east coast of Taiwan and then land in the south, or they would take off in the south and go around north. And this became regular. They did it once in November, again in December, and then all through 2017, 2018, until now, they've been doing this. It's become more and more regular. And in addition to bombers, generally they fly in groups of 2 or 4, we've seen electronic warfare aircraft. These are aircraft that would jam Taiwanese radars and American radars and Japanese radars. We've seen intelligence gathering aircraft which fly along with the bombers to soak up signals from Taiwan. We've also seen different types of fighter jets escorting them to the extent of their range. Now, they can't go all the way around Taiwan because they run out of fuel, so they go out and then they come back. These air activities have continued to increase and intensify over time. At the same time, China's been conducting more naval activity. So, for example, this past April, when the United States sent a high-ranking delegation led by Paul Ryan to Taipei to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, China sent a naval task force led by a large amphibious ship, and they parked it off the east coast of Taiwan, and they simulated invading Taiwan from the east, attacking the city of Taidong. These activities have intensified, and they become so intense that Taiwan cannot scramble every time the Chinese military approaches the island. Because if they did, they would wear out their fighter aircraft. Because each fighter aircraft only has a lifespan of about 8,000 hours. And as Rick mentioned, the Chinese have massive numbers of aircraft. Now, they have a lot of maintenance problems, so they can only fly their planes generally about 2,000 hours, sometimes 3,000 hours. But they can build them very cheaply. And so they are conducting these types of operations to disrupt Taiwanese training schedules, to put pressure on maintenance, and to destabilize the public confidence in Taiwan as well. Now, we don't know every time this happens. The US government and the Taiwanese government, they don't release information on each and every flight. So they could be going on all the time, and we wouldn't know it. But what we do know is that for the first time 2 weeks ago, Taiwan's Minister of National Defense, Yen Defa, testified before Taiwan's parliament, saying that over the past 12 months, there have been 2,000 Chinese military flights over water in the Taiwan Strait area. 2,000. And that includes not only the bombers and the other military aircraft, but also drones as well. Now, by way of comparison, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, flying from Naha Air Base in Okinawa, from 2015 to 2016 intercepted 850 Chinese military aircraft, and over the past 12 months have intercepted 638. Now, we read about the troubles between Japan and the People's Republic of China all the time. We have not seen the same level of transparency in terms of what's going on across the strait. It's intensifying. It's very, very significant ramp up of air and naval activity across from Taiwan. Now, this past August, President Trump approved the sale of 3 squadrons worth, or 66 new F-16 fighter jets to Taiwan. Now, of course, this is very positive and very helpful. It was pushed through the bureaucracy in the Pentagon as a top priority, and it was notified to Congress with record speed. But there is still a long list of things that the U.S. government could consider doing that would help cope with the obvious dangers that lie ahead of us, because China continues to build up its military, as Rick noted, and the activities that we're seeing continue to intensify. And so I thought I might suggest just a few policy changes for the US government and for the Taiwanese government, things that we can do. There's no way we can keep a balance. There's no way we can go back 10 years in time and be as safe and secure as we used to be. But there are things that we can do that would help offset or mitigate some of the negative effects of Chinese behavior. For example, the US and Taiwan could begin sharing their air and surface threat pictures. In other words, they could share their radar feeds. Taiwan has the most powerful land-based radar on the planet, but that information is not shared with the United States because current regulations prohibit that. And of course, we have some very powerful radars as well on our Aegis ships in the Western Pacific and elsewhere in Japan and South Korea, but we don't share that on a day-to-day basis with Taiwan. Now, if we were to decide to share a common operational picture of the region, it would make sense for us to exchange liaison officers. So we would have Taiwanese officers go to our command posts, and we would have American officers go to Taiwan and work in Taiwanese command posts for that purpose. We can, and I would argue we should, also be conducting joint air and naval exercises with the Taiwanese. We should also be conducting joint anti-amphibious and anti-air assault drills as well. Rick pointed out that Taiwan faces a very real invasion threat. And in the event of an invasion, we are going to be able to coordinate with the Taiwanese in supporting their self-defense only to the extent that we've practiced it in advance. And to the extent that we haven't, we're going to regret it. And lives will be unnecessarily lost because of it. Now, some of these drills that we conduct, and I hope will conduct in the future, could be conducted secretly. But some of them should also be made public, and reporters should be invited to observe in order to send the message to Beijing that we are serious about Taiwan's defense, and we are willing, we do have the resolve required to do new things. The United States government can also consider something new in sending teams of special forces experts to Taiwan, Green Berets, to live in Taiwan, not individuals. Right now there may be one or two special forces officers in Taiwan, but teams of them, companies or battalions, living in Taiwan, learning the language, studying the local battlefield, and advising their Taiwanese counterparts on irregular warfare and also psychological warfare. This is something the United States Special Forces community is very good at, and something that's going to become more and more important as China intensifies its gray zone activities around Taiwan. And finally, the United States can consider stationing American missile defense batteries in Taiwan, similar to what we have deployed in South Korea, Japan, and American territory of Guam. These could be operated by contractors, the way we do in Japan. We have 2 giant radars in Japan for this purpose. Or, alternatively, we could loan them to the Taiwanese Air Force and have Taiwanese Air Force personnel operate these and then share the take or what they collect with us. And so the room for improvement is vast, it's significant, but a lot of positive things, as Rick mentioned, are also occurring now. We have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in Taiwan making a very high-level visit. This is something new. This is something very positive. We have new talks underway between the United States and Taiwan on creating better habits of cooperation so that we can start to mitigate the common threats that we face from the Chinese Communist Party. But the room for improvement, again, is still significant, and there's a lot of hard work that is going to have to take place, and there's a lot of new policy changes that are going to have to occur if we're going to stay on top of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you to the Hudson Institute for inviting me here to speak today. Obviously, I've been asked to talk about sort of the Hong Kong effect on Taiwan. Very merging issue, I believe. Obviously, the issues surrounding both Hong Kong and Taiwan tend to evolve. I think with Hong Kong in mind, it's more day-to-day, week-to-week than issues revolving around Taiwan, but they're significant nonetheless. So many of you might not know that Taiwan is actually having a presidential election this January, and so there's a question of what sort of effect that the protests in Hong Kong and the sort of relationship with mainland China have in the effect on the elections, and of course the relationship that the United States has to play in all of this. And so I'm gonna try and get to all of that as much as I can, and hopefully leave enough time for a Q&A. So the Chinese threats to Taiwan are not new. I think we just had 3 good panelists talk about these issues. But of course, much of the eyes, I think, in the international community are on Hong Kong these days. But I think to sort of frame what effect it's actually having in Taiwan, I think there's actually a lot to suggest that it's not having as much impact as perhaps we might think it would. That's not to say that there is no impact, of course, on the elections, but I think it's not as severe as we think, right? And I'll kind of explain why. It certainly is a talking point within the campaign. The administration currently in Taiwan and the other political parties do make Hong Kong a talking point around sort of the sovereign issues of Taiwan. But like most presidential elections, it always tends to lean more toward domestic policies. And so I'll go into those a little bit later. But to sort of back up why I believe it's also not having as much effect as we might think is simply just looking at the approval ratings of the incumbent, President Tsai Ing-wen. She had very poor approval ratings at the end of last year. And so now her approval ratings are actually in the low 50s, a very significant increase since that time. But a majority of that increase actually happened prior to the protests that started roughly 6 months ago. I would actually argue that the protests, if anything, while they may have given her potentially a few points in her approval rating, maybe it's taken some approval ratings away from her competitor. I think, if anything, they've probably had a little bit more effect in just maintaining strong approval rating. I think when it comes to political elections, it tends to be external distress tends to garnish favor around keeping stability in the powers that be. Now, obviously, the Taiwanese are following this as much as we are. You can see this in a number of mediums across Taiwan. There are public events being held, film premieres, universities are opening their doors to Hong Kong students, there are petitions and so on and so forth. And so I think this is tending to resonate significantly with the youth in Taiwan for a number of reasons. Obviously, they're as much concerned about their future and their relationship with mainland China as much as the Hong Kong protesters are. But a lot of the Hong Kong protesters are also students, and so the youth of Taiwan are sort of connecting on a shared view of the threat. There's also, of course, the fact that Hong Kong and both Taiwan share successful stories in becoming free market economies in Asia, growing economically, prospering far greater than China ever did over the last 40 years. And the differences in maintaining that with the two. Seth mentioned at the beginning, of course, the NBA in Hong Kong, and there are other foreign brands that tend to be kowtowing to Beijing in the context of these protests, but Taiwan is not new to this issue. This is an issue that actually has been related to Taiwan for a number of years. We saw several years ago many foreign brands kowtowing to Beijing's wishes and how it recognizes Taiwan, how it sort of tries to find this middle ground between its financial interests and being an international brand. But so they have have dealt with this issue, and they'll continue to deal with this issue going forward, just as much as Taiwan will continue to struggle in maintaining its diplomatic alliances amongst these smaller countries that we've seen shift their allegiances across the street over the past few months. It's not just the brands. Obviously, companies have financial interests, but the governments that are meant to support and represent these companies have financial interests as well. And so we see a lot of limitations in the international community. Obviously, not every country recognizes Taiwan as its own diplomatic country, but they'll still support Taiwan sort of behind closed doors to a certain extent. And so when I say certain extent, I mean that there are many in the international community who do not support Taiwan as much as I think we would like them to. And a usual example I think of is countries' inability to invite Taiwan into the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the modern version of this, out of fear of angering Beijing and the potential retaliation that they could face. It's not just this trade agreement, it's other trade agreements that Taiwan tends to be left out on. And so this, in effect, is actually having a negative effect on Taiwan because they're not a part of the group, right? And so as these economies build these new supply chains, it's leaving Taiwan out, which has a certain effect I'll get to in just a second. It plays to sort of the financial impact that China can have on garnering favor in Taiwan and elsewhere. So within China, there's a lot of financial incentive, right? So you've seen that with the private companies, you've seen that with governments. And Beijing knows that this is true. Now, China's economy is not growing as fast as it used to, but it's still growing much faster than the other economies in the region, which is a significant incentive for people to continue to invest in China, whether we want them to or not. And so to take advantage of this, a couple years ago, at the early onset of 2018, China actually introduced 31 initiatives to sort of extrapolate labor and capital out of Taiwan. Of course, like most Chinese initiatives, there tend to be dual use, so it's not just taking labor and capital out of Taiwan, but also supplanting its Made in China 2025 initiative to sort of support China's manufacturing base over the future. There's many data points to suggest that luckily this has not had the intended effect that Beijing wanted. Perhaps it's efforts from the Tsai administration to sort of counter these incentives. Perhaps it's effects of the US-China trade war. Perhaps it is the actual projected slowing growth in China's manufacturing base, or simply the fact that Taiwanese investors understand the ulterior motives that happen within Beijing. And so just to kind of give you some facts, year over year, investment in China has dropped 50%. This is a significant drop, but it's on trend, honestly. Investment in China has been declining since 2015. 2019, there's looking to be roughly $4 billion worth of investment in China. This is 50% less than the $8.5 billion that was invested last year. There's some general trends across the strait, some reciprocity in this too. Chinese investment in Taiwan has dropped roughly 50% as well, but Chinese investment in Taiwan is roughly only $100 million, right? So a fraction of what Taiwan invests there, but again, a shift nonetheless. Because it has not had the intended effect, the 31 measures did not have the intended effect that China wants. Because they are struggling economically, and because a lot of that has to do with their poor manufacturing base, Beijing has actually just recently introduced a new measure, 26 measures. Also, again, in line with incentivizing Taiwanese labor and capital to invest in things like its development of 5G, its air transportation sector, other technology and manufacturing sectors, but also potentially to impact the upcoming election within Taiwan. It is just 2 months from this election. To sort of publish this now, obviously there are questions of ulterior motives. behind this. So why does that matter, though? Again, I sort of mentioned this at the onset. When we're talking about political elections, I see Hong Kong within the Taiwan context as a foreign policy issue. The Tsai administration, will have to deal more with the domestic issues, as all political and presidential elections do. And so one of the issues is perhaps a relaxed or a lackadays economy. That's not to say Taiwan's economy is doing poorly. It's just perhaps not what many politicians would prefer it to be. Just to kind of give you an idea, gross domestic product growth in Taiwan is roughly 3%. Inflation and unemployment are relatively low, which is nice, but exports and imports have slightly declined over the year. Manufacturing has also dipped as well. And so one of Beijing's incentives is to take advantage of this and again say, well, if you're not getting the investment and growth you can get at home, why not come across the street and invest here and everything will be fine. Obviously, that perhaps, again, won't have the intended effect that Beijing would like, but it's a concern nonetheless. And I think that, along with other efforts by Beijing to sort of draw out the future of U.S.-Taiwan relationships, is having more of an effect than perhaps the Hong Kong effect in Taiwan local elections. How does the United States fit into all this? Obviously, the Congress just passed the 2 Hong Kong bills, and those will go to the president for his decision. Looking at sort of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, irrespective of that, before that, arms sales have been increasing. There have been more congressional visits, I think, than ever before. And so there's a lot of support. Perhaps it is in support of Taiwan. Perhaps it's also tangent to the fact that we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act this year. Many other reasons, but there can be more. There can always be more. And so while lower level visits have occurred, we do not have secretarial level visits. We haven't had them in a while. And it's actually part of the Taiwan Travel Act to incentivize greater secretarial level visits. We could also be doing more on other issues like trade and investment to sort of supplant the concerns that Taiwan might have about its economy and the pressure from China's economy. We haven't had trade and investment framework agreement talks for 3 years now. There have been no efforts from this administration to pursue a trade agreement with Taiwan, even though it would probably be the easiest trade agreement for them to get if you're taking it in context with the other trade agreements that have taken so long to negotiate over the past 3 years. And so that being said, I'm happy to answer questions about this. I'm supportive of this administration and their efforts to be supportive of Taiwan. There can always be more, and so I'm hopeful that over the next year, perhaps post-presidential election in Taiwan, U.S. and Taiwan relations can, again, sort of reboot and take a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, all members of the panel. We'll have a question period now, and some of the questions may actually have answers. I'm going to exercise my prerogative here and ask the first one, and that's for anybody who cares to answer. Riley, you mentioned the elections that are coming up in January. Any thoughts among all the panel here about what, if any, interest that the PRC is taking in or interfering in the democratic process in Taiwan?
I mean, I'd say definitely. If you look even at the election, there was a surprise election in Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan, which is traditionally DPP, the president's party. Does very well there, but the KMT won. And we're talking debates here about foreign interference. There's still a lack of accounting about all of the digital efforts that put Han into power. I will say it's nice that the White House no longer wages political warfare against Taiwan to the benefit of those who want closer union with China. In the Bush administration and the Obama administration, it was considered pretty common knowledge, I think, that Washington was rooting for the KMT. In fact, you had senior directors who were, not quoted by name, but probably put information out in the press, and it was clearly interpreted this way in Taiwan. But yeah, going back to your original question, I think China doesn't leave these things to chance. It's actually, quite good at political warfare.
I think the general assumption in Washington is that Beijing wants the KMT to win because KMT seems a little bit more cooperative with Beijing. I don't necessarily see that as Beijing's motive. I don't. Obviously, the rhetoric out of Beijing, out of Xi Jinping over the past 4 years has been very anti-President Tsai. But I think if we take Hong Kong into context, I think they're more than happy to just have political unrest between the parties and sort of build what's happening in Hong Kong is this division between the people and the government.
Thank you. Right. We'll open the floor to questions. Let's start here in the first row, and we'll move our way back. Again, if you would please identify yourself and your organization and to whom the question is addressed.
Richard Juning, I'm just unaffiliated. Anybody can answer this question. It's a basic question about what will be the U.S.'s response if, in fact, there is an invasion.
The problem is we don't know. And so when people make their war plans or their defensive plans, when Taiwan, they have their own national defense plans. Of course, we have our own war plans for the defense of Taiwan. When that is going on, nobody knows what the other side's going to do. Nobody knows the timetables that the other side is using. Nobody knows the basic assumptions that are going into the other side's calculations. We're not able to do war games together to practice it. And the war games that we do to practice ours and the war games that they do to practice theirs may not be reflective of reality because we don't talk to each other in that way. We don't share that kind of information. And so that's a problem. And so that is something that the United States and Taiwan, the officials in charge of that business need to think long and hard about doing, because we're not going to be able to defend Taiwan if we're not fighting shoulder to shoulder with them. And they're not going to be able to defend themselves effectively if they're not fighting shoulder to shoulder with us. And until we can get to a place where we're able to do that, I think the risk of conflict is much higher because we're weaker. And China knows this very well. The Chinese Communist Party is very, very good at creating divisions between allies and partners. And unfortunately, we've allowed them to do that in this case. And so that's something that we need to work on.
I would offer that the invasion of Taiwan is already underway. I mean, we've spoken about the political interference, the external military pressures, and of course, the preparations. So the invasion, I would say, is underway. And what are we doing about it? Well, during the previous administration, half of that administration was spent trying to figure out whether there was indeed a problem, and then what should we do? And about halfway through the administration, yes, policies and actions began to percolate in a positive direction. But under the current administration, I think what we can conclude clearly is that they are seized by the China challenge, and the more that they look at it, the more layers, the broader it is, and it's not just a matter of being unprepared for deterring the invasion, but also unprepared for securing dominance of the Earth-Moon system, dominance at sea, and countering the Chinese quest for global hegemony rolled out practically every month in the institutions that it's creating to advance that level of global control. But what it's really coming down to now is whether the United States will deploy the capabilities necessary to deter China on the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere in Asia. Will the missiles be developed? Will they be deployed? Will we resume production of the necessary numbers of tactical nuclear weapons, warheads and such, that make it clear to the Chinese that if they start an invasion, it will be shut down in its early hours.
And I'd just add, I don't take anything, I wouldn't take anything away from Rick. I think that's very astute and that right. I would just note that the trend line, I think, is toward, if not an outright defense guarantee. A change from, was it Brzezinski, who in answering the Chinese said, you don't know and we don't know if we would defend Taiwan in a war. Bush seemed at one point to flirt with a, almost an overt defense guarantee saying we would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. But I think just if you look at the trend line with America waking up to the threat from China, and there was talk of a pivot to Asia and the Pacific. I'm not sure it's actually happened yet militarily, but the politics, at least, I think are there. And certainly, an administration has to weigh a lot of things, but congressional support from Taiwanese Americans, outrage if we didn't actually do something significant if there were an invasion. I think it's going in the direction of a close to a guarantee.
Well, and former Speaker Gingrich's comment, whatever number of years ago, that hell yes, we would absolutely defend Taiwan. For however one takes that, does express, I think, the general sentiment in Congress, which is very pro-Taiwan. And that's something that any president would have to take into account. Other questions? We can't do all the first row at the first time. This lady here. Yes, ma'am.
This is Tina Chung with the Voice of America's Chinese branch. My question, I haven't heard anything on the last Sunday's Chinese the first self-made aircraft carrier transiting through Taiwan Strait. The security experts here I'm addressing too. What do you think the message from the Chinese PLA is? Is it intended to coerce, intimidate Taiwanese people ahead of the election, or is it more intended for the U.S. Staking a position that you cannot interfere in Chinese domestic affairs?
Well, Tina, yes, this is very much a message of intimidation directed at the people of Taiwan, an effort to influence the election, as well as to intimidate the United States and Japan. The aircraft carrier has recently emerged in imagery taken over the last 24 hours in the new nuclear base in Sanya on Hainan Island. For the first time, we see that carrier number 2 has an air wing, fighters and helicopters on the deck. These may start operations in the South China Sea, and we'll soon be seeing reams of nice pictures of aircraft taking off the carrier. But the 2 carriers means that the PLA can provide air support for operations all around Taiwan, 360 degrees. When carrier number 3 enters service, let's say 2022, 2023, that will further increase the ability to project force onto Taiwan. But some of us posit that the PLA isn't going to stop there. Perhaps they'll build 10 carriers, maybe 15. Once they start producing them, there's no telling when they'll stop.
Question from the third row. Gentleman there.
Hi, Yuhua Chen from George Washington University. I'm wondering any one of you can comment something about China's cyber warfare capability, because cyber domain has been part of traditional military domain for a long time, and Chinese government just established a strategic force in 2015. So this factor obviously is a very important factor that Taiwanese government has to face when it comes to China's threat. Thank you.
Their capabilities are very good. And one of the reasons they're very good is that not only are they investing very, very heavily in these types of technologies within China itself, they're also hiring a lot of foreign engineers around the world. So, for example, one of China's national champions for artificial intelligence has an artificial intelligence lab they've established in Silicon Valley, and they hire American engineers, some of the best and the brightest in our country, to go work for them. They also have a lab that does autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, and drones as well. They have Huawei, for example, has a lab in Canada that hires hundreds of Canadian engineers. And you see this all around the world with all the most advanced economies. We also have our best and brightest, both for cybersecurity, now going to China to participate in cyber warfare or cybersecurity exercises that are being hosted in Beijing. They used to be hosted just in Las Vegas, just the United States. Now those are also being hosted in Beijing. And some of those designers, some of those hackers are staying in China. Or they're coming back to the United States afterwards and they continue to collaborate. We also have some of our best companies, Microsoft, for example, Intel, and many others, have set up their research and development labs. Their largest outside of the United States are all in Beijing, in the center of China's military civil fusion district of Beijing, where they're operating daily, day in and day out, side by side with China's cyber warriors. And so this is a fight that we're currently losing, in my view, and it's something that I think our companies and our government needs to be much more serious about, and we need to, at a minimum, make sure that we are not having our best minds support the Chinese Communist Party and its armed wing, the PLA, because that's currently the case.
I would also add that the formation of the Strategic Support Force constitutes a turning point in modern warfare, a turning point that democracies have yet to make and may be very challenged in trying to put into effect. The Strategic Support Force encompasses so much more than just cyber warfare. It is a service with the mission of dominating, securing the information realm. That information realm starts in outer space. The Strategic Support Force is responsible for putting satellites, maintaining satellite formations, and also shooting them down. Strategic Support Force is responsible for broad cyber warfare, broad cyber intelligence, the melding of artificial intelligence with cyber and manipulative warfare, taking over television stations, projecting fake broadcasts to induce populations to want to surrender. It's a very pernicious capability, one that we have no intention at this point at matching, but we must clearly defend ourselves against it. It's not just a threat to Taiwan, it's a threat to the world. And when you sell your country's information backbone to Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE, you're basically selling your information sovereignty to the Chinese Communist Party. It's not just a matter of what they'll gather about everything you do on your phone, your life on your phone. It's how they'll manipulate it and manipulate your life so that if you have any negative thoughts about China, post on Facebook or Twitter or this or that, it'll come back and bite you, for real.
Let's see. The gentleman in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Tom Neer. I'm a retired FBI.
There's a microphone.
My name is Tom Neer. I'm a retired FBI agent. My question has to do with, to Rick, specifically you were mentioning about the PLA's capabilities in space, and we're hearing more and more about that. So my question is, are there any, to your knowledge, is there any scientific collaboration between the Taiwanese and the PLA in terms of development of any space projects that the United States military or security might find to be troublesome?
Well, interesting question. Space cooperation between the PRC and Taiwan. I can't speak on any from any specific knowledge. Professors come and go. Perhaps they go to school in Taiwan. Perhaps they move to China and gain jobs in the military-industrial complex. That level of concern certainly should be there for the counterintelligence units of not just Taiwan, but the United States and others. But the challenge really in terms of China, Taiwan, and space is helping now to enable Taiwan to be a partner for the United States and other democracies in space. I mean, right now, when China launches a high orbit satellite, it usually flies out of Jiuquan or Taiwan and flies right over Taiwan. So, if there was an idea of maybe interfering with that capability, they're flying right over the key defensive location at a very vulnerable point in their launch cycle. Unfortunately, the United States has had a history of leaning on Taiwan not to develop long-range missiles. And about a decade ago, when Taiwan was beginning to develop a new long-range land attack cruise missile, there was a specific effort to try to deny Taiwan access to parts that would make those cruise missiles work. Today, Taiwan needs those cruise missiles. It is, according to Taiwan press reports, possibly producing them and deploying them. Taiwan is going to require a large number of them, and they'll also require new long-range ballistic missiles if they're going to prevail by deterring the PLA, and by doing so, keep our soldiers and service people out of a war. It's to our advantage now that Taiwan has the ability not just to have these long-range missiles, but also to launch early warning satellites into low Earth orbit. Taiwan, I think, has maybe 2 or 3 satellites capable of 1 to 10 meter resolution imagery. The PLA, I believe, has 50 to 60 up there now, and is on its way to putting thousands up there as companies in China and such come up with these new, very large constellations of very small satellites. Allowing Taiwan to loft maybe 100 microsatellites, enabling Taiwan to have that capability, could go very far to deterring the PLA as it begins its preparations for a major attack. If the PLA knows that they're going to be intimately targeted by Taiwanese and then American forces from the get-go, that they can't shoot down all of Taiwan's satellites, that will cause some second thoughts in the Central Military Commission.
Let's go for another question in the back there, and then we'll start moving forward with such time as we have left.
I think it's an awesome idea.
I agree.
I will say, I think it's probably unrealistic, which is disappointing. This is something that could be done with the stroke of a pen by the Assistant Secretary for East Asia or, almost anyone at the NSC. Hope springs eternal.
I think we have to be a little more creative and to try to think about what is the world going to look like when we get to the year 2030 or 2040 if we continue on the current path. Right now, Taiwan is completely isolated. We don't do even the bare minimum of what's required, in my view, to prepare for a potential Chinese attack on Taiwan. That China has nuclear weapons, Taiwan doesn't. China has thousands of ballistic missiles, and we've not allowed Taiwan to have any. We have no US troops in Taiwan to serve as a strategic tripwire. And so we don't do ship visits, we don't do joint exercises. Our arms sales to Taiwan have recently been robust this year, but prior to this year they weren't. They're very spotty. And so where in the world is a favorable balance going to come from? Where is strategic stability going to come from? We would never do this with Estonia or Latvia or Poland or South Korea or any other ally because we know it's not wise. We know from our strategic competition with the Soviet Union and more recently with North Korea that when you have an ambitious dictator who has said as a matter of policy, I intend to annex that other territory. It belongs to me. It always belonged to me. It ought to belong to me, the way North Korea says about South Korea, the way Russia says about the Baltic states, and the way Xi Jinping has repeatedly said, including in this year, about Taiwan. That this is bananas. It makes no sense at all. But we continue on this path out of fear for what Beijing might think or what its reaction might be. I think we need to think about what the world's going to look like in 2030 if we continue on this path. I also think it's obvious that we need to develop a roadmap for normalizing relations with Taiwan in an incremental fashion. I think the Trump administration perhaps has begun that process. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to do all the other things because the State Department will constantly say, hey, we have unofficial relations. And so that means we have to restrict ourselves. We can't do X, Y, and Z. Well, if we don't do X, Y, and Z, then we're asking for a lot of trouble in the decade ahead. And so we need to start being more ambitious and I think more forward-looking in how we treat Taiwan.
I would posit that I think the efforts by the Trump administration to counter China's sharp power is not specifically within the context of allowing Taiwan to keep its diplomatic allies. Right? It is in the context of countering China's sharp power across the Indo-Pacific. Whether Taiwan can manage to maintain those diplomatic allies, I think that's a positive externality of all this. But at the end of the day, I think it truly is the sort of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship that matters the most. There are ways that I think they've talked about trying to integrate these efforts, U.S. efforts to counter sharp power within the context of Taiwan's southbound policy as well. There could always be more toward that effort, engaging more on not just strategic issues, but economic, labor, other technical issues as well, to sort of build this sort of integration within Taiwan, across the Indo-Pacific, and so on.
Steve, I would just add that, there are even effective rhetorical turns that we can begin to make that will benefit Taiwan's diplomatic standing, perhaps not so much its number of recognizing allies and partners, but the Chinese have Taiwan outgunned in terms of economic and political network building. There's just more to gain from switching your relations to Beijing. What the United States, however, can do is project far more powerfully the point that you, small country in the South Pacific or in the Caribbean, your relationship with Taiwan will determine the degree to which China smothers you or not, whether you retain your sovereignty in as much as China is threatening every aspect of sovereignty for Taiwan. Secretary Pompeo, just the other day, calls out the threat from the Chinese Communist Party for the first time. There's at least perhaps a willingness there to be much more focused in terms of connecting the positive benefits of maintaining a strong relationship with Taiwan, even if it's unofficial, with your future security and sovereignty.
Well, we've gone 3 minutes over, which is not a great sin. But before or in the process of thanking our panel and all of you for coming today, I'd like to point out an observation here, and that is that to the extent that you're hearing a certain amount of frustration from the panel about what the United States is doing, that it is a reflection of the difference between what there is and what the expectations are, and from the United States at least. Because I think one of the signal accomplishments of the Trump administration is to change the way that certainly policymakers and the policymaking community and the country itself thinks about China. From the past 40 years, where the effort has been to somehow or other make China a stakeholder, a so-called stakeholder in the liberal international order, to an understanding that a strategic competition is a better characterization of the relationship between the United States and China. And I think that my fellow members of the panel here think that we're waiting for so we're at the point of what's the next step? How does that transform itself into our relationship with Taiwan? That's an unanswered question, and it's one that I expect that future conferences here at Hudson Institute will address and continue to address. And on that, I would like to thank you again for coming out this afternoon. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you to the panel. We'll see you next time.